Welcome to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin.
And I'm Bobby Mixa.
And today we are joined by our good friend, Richard DeClue, who joined us not too long ago to talk about his excellent book, The Mind of Benedict XVI, A Theology of Communion. You should all definitely go and listen to that episode. But more importantly for Richard, you should go and buy that book. Anywhere you can buy books, you can find Richard's book. It's excellent. And today we're going to kind of continue that conversation a little bit, I would say, because we're going to talk about a recent article that Richard has published, a really excellent article, a really useful article in the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology. And the title of the article is Eucharistic Ecclesiology. So Richard's going to tell us what that means. But first, we'd like to say, hello, Richard. How are you?
Hello. It's good to be here and see you guys again. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, it's like a meeting of old friends when we get together and do this. We really enjoy just kind of chatting theology with our old buddy here. So good to see you again, Richard. Let's just jump right in. I'll just sort of get the ball rolling by asking you, for people who are totally unfamiliar with these terms, Eucharistic Ecclesiology. I think they will probably understand. They've heard the first word in that sequence, but what do we mean when we say Eucharistic Ecclesiology? Just in a nutshell.
Right. So a way of talking about Eucharistic ecclesiology is that it's basically a sub-branch or approach to ecclesiology. So ecclesiology being theology of the church or theology about the church as a theological object. So it's the study of the church from a theological perspective. And it studies the origin, nature, structure, and mission of the church. And then Eucharistic, as the adjective, means that it emphasizes the connection between the church and the Eucharist. And so how the sacrament of the Eucharist is intrinsically tied up with the church and vice versa, that the church is understood in this Eucharistic lens.
Richard, when did that term, maybe to jump into things right away here, when did that term start getting used, Eucharistic ecclesiology?
Generally, it's understood to have been coined by Nicholas Afanasiev, the Russian emigre who was studying in Paris. So he was a Russian Orthodox theologian. And so like the early 20th century, but he used it to describe, and I think this is important. So he coined the term then, but he used it to describe his understanding of the ecclesiology of the church fathers. So he was arguing that this is the vision of the church that they had from the very beginning during the patristic era.
And like, what was he reacting to?
Well, I think there could be a tendency of, I don't like oversimplifying the earlier theology, but there could be during certain periods of time an emphasis on the hierarchical constitution of the church. The church is a perfect society. And so it was very much focused on juridical aspects of the church and governance and the structure overall. And I think in some ways he was trying to bring out the more mystical, sacramental dimension of the church and its rootedness in her divine origin and being, and something that's sort of a mystery of the faith, not just a concrete structural reality. Although, as you know, the article has a whole section on the structure of the church. Those two things are not separable, but I think he was just trying to bring out again the understanding that the church is Eucharistic. And that's also was important in a certain sense for ecumenical reasons, or so to speak, the existence of a variety of ecclesial communities, some of whom do not have the Eucharist. And so it also becomes an important way of discussing what the essence of the church is and how the Eucharist is not something accidental to the church. It is actually a part of her very essence. And so to lack the Eucharist is to fail to be church in the full theological sense. And so I think all of those aspects sort of are behind the motivation of dealing with that.
Richard, you mentioned how the kind of driving force behind some of this kind of comes from the East, comes from Orthodoxy, but it gets adopted, it gets it gets taken on by some key figures in the 20th century in the Western Church, in the Catholic Church, as part of the Ressourcement movement. So, it occurred to me as I was reading this and thinking about some other things as well, that like it's not to say, and maybe you can correct me on this, but it's not to say that the church kind of in her official understanding of herself forgot this idea of her identity as communion. But it did seem to be the case somewhere along the line in modernity that your typical Catholic began to think of the church as the place where you go to get your communion rather than communion, right? Maybe I'll just throw that to you and see what you think with that about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you read the article, one thing that people might notice is how much which is not necessarily typical of a lot of works on Eucharistic ecclesiology, how much I cite preconciliar Thomists and try to show that this is not something that was lost in the scholastic era or even the post-Tridentine era or the preconciliar period, before Vatican II. I mean, the basic principles and elements of Eucharistic ecclesiology were already there. It's very explicit in Aquinas. But you're correct that in the general emphasis or understanding of the person in the pew, that connection was not always obvious. It's like, well, Mass is just this thing we do on Sundays. And it's a little bit ironic because we call it Holy Communion. But I don't think most people ever stop to think, well, why do we call it Holy Communion? I think it just becomes, in most people's head, it's just, flying mammals are bats and the thing that they swing at the World Series is a bat. They're just two different uses of the same word that sounds and spelled the same. It's like, no, it's called Holy Communion because of the communion of the church that it brings into being and affects. But yeah, I don't think most people in the pew ever think of that. They might think, well, it's the way I commune with the Lord, but then they don't see the further aspect of, well, by communing with Christ, I'm also communing with his whole body, the church. And it's not just me and Jesus, it's also the communion of the whole church that comes about through this reception of Holy Communion.
Yeah. And maybe if I could just follow up real quick, I think it's useful to point out, as you do in the article, like, it's not to say that, like, from, a Protestant might say about a particular issue, well, the church sort of got something wrong and now we need to kind of like go back to the source and fix it or something like that. And that's certainly not what we would say as Catholics, but it is useful to go back to the source to sort of remember the proper trajectory. And so one of the things that really struck me, and I have to admit, I never thought this through well enough before I read your article, which was just thinking of when and what exactly is the origin of the church. And what I mean is this, like, we tend to think of, okay, Pentecost is the birthday of the church. Like, that's just something that people say, right? And of course, in one way, that's right. But you point out that, like, if that's true, or maybe you're kind of referring to another thinker when you make this point, but if it's yours, please tell me and claim it. But that in a sense, like, we need to remember that the conception of the church is at the Last Supper, right? So in a sense, like, the Eucharist is part of the origin story of the church.
Yeah, exactly. And so I don't know that I ever encountered that notion of the conception of the church elsewhere. So I think it was my conception, but who knows? Maybe I read it somewhere and forgot. But I was trying to explain sort of the explication of the connection between the church and the Last Supper and the cross. The church fathers, as I mentioned in the article, often saw a connection between, the Gospel of John, where, Jesus is on the cross and from his side comes forth water and blood. And they saw that as an image of the bride of Christ coming forth from the side of the new Adam, the same way that Eve came forth from the side of Adam when he was in a deep sleep. So too Christ is in a deep sleep of death, and out of his side comes, his new bride. The water and the blood symbolizing the baptism and the Eucharist, two of the sacraments of initiation that bring forth the church and make one a member of the church. And so during the patristic era, this was a clear reference to the fact that the church comes forth from the side of Christ as the effect of, it's like right after he dies. It's like, well, what does his death accomplish? The church. The church is what his death accomplishes. And so there's this sense in which the church comes into existence through that sacrifice. And he already anticipated this at the Last Supper. When he institutes the Eucharist as the perpetual memorial of his suffering in advance of the actual death. So, John Paul II and Benedict XVI both saw this connection as extremely important. And so, given the fact that we often refer to as Pentecost as the birth of the church, because that's when she went forth, right? So she went forth and began to proclaim once she received the further outpouring of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, she goes forth into the world, but she already existed, right? He already established the church on the apostles. He already gave them his authority. He already told them to go forth into the world. He already instituted the Eucharist. So the church already existed. It's not like the conception and birth are at the same time. So the church was sort of awaiting this during that 50-day period, was sort of gestating, and then, went forth into the world and then brought all these sacraments to those it evangelized.
Yeah, I've heard one time a theologian say that perhaps maybe we should start to think about at the Annunciation, when you have Christ being conceived in the womb of the Virgin Mary as the beginning, once he takes on flesh, as the beginning of the church. I mean, I've always found these kind of like, well, where's the beginning of the church debate to be a little bit like abstract to me. And I'm like, okay, well, if, the fullness of God becoming all in all, and you kind of like it all becoming incorporated into the man, and being members of his body, why don't we just say that we go right back to the moment where he actually had the true body of his actual flesh? I'm now, correct me here, all the mistakes I'm making theologically, but is there anything to this? And maybe did I perhaps mishear this theologian even propose this? The theologian's name, by the way, is Nick Healy. And I'm just Nick Healy. If I got that wrong, please write me a scathing email back, and I will correct this.
Well, yeah. I mean, in some sense, we're using metaphors and analogies. So you can speak about these things in different ways. I mean, certainly Christ is the head of the church, and if the head already exists, and in other ways, we talk about the church existing from the time of Abel the just until the last of the elect, right? So, the preexistence of the church in Israel and the people Israel. And, so all of these are somewhat analogous. I think the reason we talk about the church as the final kahal, the final gathering of God's people, is because we've now entered in through his passion and death, and then the incorporation into him, which happens through baptism in the Holy Eucharist. This is like the definitive stage. This is now entering in the eschatological stage. We're no longer in like the prefigurement stage or the preparation stage. Like, we're entering into that like final state. And since it's head and members, or the whole Christ, as Augustine uses that phrase for the Christ and the church, that one complex mystery. In some sense, it's not until the saving work of the cross is complete. And you could also argue, well, of course, the resurrection and ascension play a role here too, but the sacrifice that wins the forgiveness of sins, which is applied to people before it happens, of course, but that is the saving event, and it's that which it makes possible the unity of people with Christ in a means that takes away their sins. And therefore, I think it's because it's through that cross that we gain access to being united with him in grace, that we can conceive of the church as coming into existence through that reality.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Richard, before we started recording, Bobby and I both held up our copies of Henri de Lubac's book Catholicism, which is a key text for us, and for you too, I know. Oh, there it is. Yeah. But you talk about and Bobby just held up the book that I want to get your thoughts on now, which you talk about in your article, which is Henri de Lubac's book Corpus Mysticum. I first learned about this work when I was still an Anglican from an Anglican scholar named Nathan Jennings. And he described something that really blew my mind at the time, which you sort of make the same point that this scholar Nathan Jennings made, which was, although we as Catholics are certainly always talking about the development of doctrine, we're not talking about the actual teaching of the church changing. Nonetheless, there was a point in the 11th century, I believe, where the church shifted the vocabulary that it used somewhat about the presence of Christ in the Eucharist and the presence of Christ in the people of God. Can you explain that and why that's important?
Yeah, so basically, de Lubac's overall, he basically says it's an historical analysis, but he's doing that for a reason, and he's trying to show that first of all, he laments the notion that people in the modern era think mystical means not real or only symbolic. And so when we're talking about the church as the mystical body, it's like, oh, well, that's just this nice thought. It's sort of this abstract idea that makes us feel good, but it's not real, right? And therefore, and then the sacramental body, well, that's the real presence. Through the consecration, Jesus is really there, but we're only mystically the body of Christ. And he kind of thinks that that's one that's just a false way of looking at things, as if mystery or sacramental are somehow not real, because he thinks in some sense they're really real. But he does this historical analysis of the terminology. And he basically says that the term mystical body was often used to describe the Eucharist. And in some sense, the church was understood as the real body. Mm-hmm. And in reaction against the Berengarian heresy, which was denying, the full reality of the Eucharist, it became expedient to emphasize the fact that no, by calling the Eucharist the mystical body, we don't mean that it's not real. And so the terminology ends up getting switched to reject a heresy that was basically denying that Jesus was really, truly, substantially present, body, blood, soul, and divinity. And so in reaction, we start talking about the church as the real presence of the Christ, the real body, and then the church is the mystical body. But he basically does that as a way of showing that both are real. There's not a separation between, and he's trying to also emphasize the fact that the church as the body of Christ should not be reduced to this mere abstract, nice idea, but that there's a reality that's being made present. And in another article I wrote for Evangelization and Culture online on de Lubac on this point, he basically says Eucharistic or ecclesial realism implies and requires Eucharistic realism. So if the Eucharist truly makes the church, then the Eucharist itself must also be real, so that they imply one another. Like if the church really is an effect of the Eucharist, that can only happen because the Eucharist itself is real. And so ecclesial realism and Eucharistic realism go together. And so he's trying to emphasize that fact that no, this is a spiritual reality, but spiritual and mystical are real things. They're not some sort of false, made up notions. And so he was just doing that as a way of saying, just because we call the church the mystical body now, doesn't mean we shouldn't think of this in a realism way.
It's interesting with like de Lubac. I mean, how much he contributed to this Eucharistic ecclesiology that with its place kind of in Vatican II. So how much of this, like if you were to go through the text of Vatican II, say on the church, on Lumen Gentium, would you find this language already being there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can certainly see aspects of it in there. I don't know if I'm trying to think if there's any explicit references. I mean, I know there are references in Lumen Gentium to this reality. I can't think of the exact quotes off the top of my head. But it's certainly present in the whole notion that the church is connected to the Eucharist explicitly, and that in Lumen Gentium, it makes very clear that in order to be church in the full sense, you have to have valid Eucharist. And that's why the council uses different terms. When it talks about churches and ecclesial communities, it's making a distinction.
Yeah.
Saying if you don't have valid apostolic succession, that means you don't have valid Eucharist. That means you're not really church. Because in some sense, the church is the Eucharistic assembly. And you can't be what we understand the church to be apart from the Eucharist. That without the Eucharist, you're ecclesial-like, you're sort of similar to the church, but you don't have the fullness of what the church is apart from the Eucharist.
Yeah, I mean, namely, you don't have full communion, right? I mean, you're not fully in communion by virtue of lacking the authority and the structure and that sort of thing. And just real quick, because I know, Bobby, you want to jump back in on this, but I liked, Richard, how, you talk on the one hand about how, like, referencing John Zizulis again, and just, the idea that, like, there's a real mark of unity there among Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox in the centrality of the Eucharist in the life of the church. And at the same time, the Protestants who are sort of working on this stuff, there's an interesting kind of sign of encouragement, but also something sort of to lament. And you referenced the 1982 document, Baptism, Eucharist, Ministry from the World Council of Churches. I just have to say really quickly something about this because, having been an Anglican myself, documents like this were like I took a seminar on some ecumenical stuff, and particularly we really delved into this document, the BEM document, with a professor at Yale named David Kelsey, who was a part of the Yale School, theologian, really brilliant guy. And he kind of walked us through this or whatever. We also read the response to BEM by Joseph Ratzinger, which was super interesting to read. And, I was sitting there in the room just kind of thinking to myself, Ratzinger is basically saying to all these Protestants, like, good job, like, prioritizing this stuff. But honestly, we're not really going to get anywhere talking about any of this because of the lack of kind of structure and authority that you all have. And so I just wanted to raise that because sometimes it can, we can get a little kumbaya-ish about communion and about, let's all just sort of find our unity and, and all that sort of thing. But actually it's a tougher unity, right? Than just the sort of like, oh, let's all just sit around and break bread together. And that means we're united, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple things come to mind. One, for those who tend to think that ecumenism is this weak thing and it sort of waters down the faith, and Vatican II was wrong for pushing ecumenism. It's like, have you read Unitatis Redintegratio? Look at just the first sentence, for crying out loud. That document is rather blunt, that Christ, it says from the beginning, Christ founded one church and one church only.
Yep.
And it says that the Catholic Church is the Church of Christ, or the Church that subsists in the Catholic Church, and that the purpose of ecumenism, it basically says nothing. It decries false Irenicism, which refuses to present the fullness of the faith for the sake of just being peaceable. And then it basically concludes with the whole purpose of ecumenical movement is to get all of the Christian communities to rejoin the church and celebrate the Eucharist together. Like that's sort of like the goal, which means it can't just stay on this level of, oh, look, we have things in common. Isn't that nice? It's like that's a starting point, but that's the purpose. The end goal is reunion as one church. And it says, look, this unity we already have. Like, so if you read the document, it's very explicit. Like the Catholic Church already has this unity. It's been lost. Let's work towards bringing you guys back into full communion. And if you read the document, that's very clear. There's nothing, relativistic or anything about that document whatsoever. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the gifts that these communities have to bring back into full communion, or the gifts that they have to share, do not actually include the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. That's what's lacking. So anyway, to me, this stuff, for me as a Protestant, really like agonizing over whether to become Catholic, was actually all very encouraging, because it was this invitation into the real and into the fullness. And so for me, then, this notion that you're really such an expert on this, Eucharistic ecclesiology is so important, so important.
Yeah, it's very, and this is where DeClue, I think, deserves a lot of the credit, because as the article, I did try to emphasize the existence of a lot of these themes and principles before the council, because they are there. They're in the Thomists, are already talking about the Eucharist as the res tantum of the sacrament of the Eucharist, just as Aquinas did. They're talking about how it's the sacrament of charity, and that's what binds us together more perfectly. I mean, it's all there, but DeClue deserves a lot of credit, as then Ratzinger pointed out. Like, well, DeClue's the one that sort of like put that aspect to the forefront, right? And he's like, no, guys, look, this is the best way we can talk about the church, is through this Eucharistic understanding. And like, let's make this the major theme, and not just like this side thing we talk about. Like, no, let's put this front and center, because it really does help express the very essence of the church in a way that nothing else does. Because in a certain sense, Eucharistic ecclesiology, and I mentioned this in the article, it's not just about the church and the Eucharist. It's sort of like the Eucharist is where the mysteries of the Trinity, the Incarnation, soteriology, eschatology, and ecclesiology all come together, and sacramental theology. All of those are sort of present in this one, this is the nexus where all those mysteries are the most palpably or visibly intertwined, because it's all of that together. To understand Eucharistic ecclesiology is to see how all those aspects of the mysteries, cohere as one great mystery.
Richard, going back to like the Orthodox Catholic conversations on this, you mentioned obviously Ratzinger, and I'm never sure if I'm saying his name correctly. Zizioulas, is that correct?
I say Zizioulas,
Okay.
because I think there's an I before the OUL. So Zizioulas is how I learned to say it.
Okay. Maybe can you explain some of I find what's fascinating here with talking about kind of the universal and the particular, then also getting into kind of like the whole and the parts, bringing in some of the language that you find talking about, like how we talk about the body. Could you explain some of that? Because I think some of that might be a little bit confusing. And I mean, there's all these intense debates, and I think this is really one of the richest. I mean, your whole essay is very rich, but this is one of I think the richest sections. It's in the structure of the church section, the third section.
Yeah. So in the structure of the church section, I have, I talk about the hierarchical constitution of the church, of course, and the connection between the church's hierarchical constitution in general and Eucharistic hierarchical structure, and how those two go together. Like, it's not an accident that the bishop is the high priest and he's also the head of the diocese, and all those sorts of things. But then another aspect of the church structure has to do with the relationship between the church as local and the church as universal. And so it is a very difficult thing to wrap one's head around. In some sense, it is mysterious. But there's sort of a tendency in the Eastern Orthodox churches to emphasize the local church as that which is really church. So the individual dioceses, in some sense, each patriarchate, but there really is this emphasis on the local or particular church headed by the bishop as sort of being fully church, right? It has all the essential elements. And because of that, there's a need for them to be in communion with one another. But you can almost get the sense that what they're looking at is the universal church is really a federation of local churches. It's sort of like you've got the church in Moscow, you got the church in Constantinople, or I guess Istanbul now, or you got the church in Washington, D.C., you've got the church over there, and then, well, because they're all the same reality, they need to be in communion with each other. And when they're not, that's a shame. But they're still just all fully church. And hopefully they can be in mutual recognition of one another and in communion in some sense. And they should work together. But it's sort of like the universal church is not really fully church, as Zizioulas kind of says. Now, it depends on what passage you read from Zizioulas, where he's sort of like, it's a coincidence, like they're simultaneously local and universal. But then he's got that quote I use where he says, well, technically what's really church is the concrete local church. And then, anything that facilitates union on a supradiocesan level is just, it's sort of only analogously church. Like what's really church is the local church. And to that, the Catholic position basically is like, no. No. What, now within the Catholic Church is the Ratzinger-Casper debate, and Teilhard's got his own kind of in-between view on it. But I push heavily the Ratzingerian CDF understanding of this. But that, no, what first exists is the one church. You don't even have local churches that just, a local church cannot establish itself. It has to, in certain sense, bud off from the universal church as a particular instantiation of the one church. Okay, and so that it receives its being as church from the universal church. And so there's this ontological and temporal priority of the universal church, which then makes itself present with all of her essential elements in the various places. But so the particular church, then and this is something that the Catholic doctrine affirms, the particular church or the diocese or eparchy is not just a part of the church, the way that a finger is a part of my hand, is a part of my arm, is a part of my body. It's not just a department. So it's not merely a part. It has all the essential elements of the church. And in that sense, it has this, what's called qualitative Catholicity, right? It's according to the whole. It's got a certain wholeness to it as the church, but only because it is the presence of the one church in this given time and place. It doesn't have a reality, an independent reality that can perdure apart from the church universal. For one thing, it can't give itself a bishop, right? It has to receive the sacrament of holy orders from the one church. It has to be given and established as a diocese or eparchy from somewhere. It can't just do that itself. And then to sustain itself, if a bishop dies, it can't even replace its own bishop. It has to receive an episcopal consecration from outside, usually from at least 3 other bishops from the surrounding region. And so the individual local churches are not independent, and they are not self-sustaining, and that their existence is received from the one church of Christ, which is the universal church. And it's the church, therefore, even though it is both one and many, it's the one that's present in the many. And I use an analogy, and I always get nervous when I create some of these analogies, but it just dawned on me when I was doing Eucharistic Ecclesiology. I'm like, well, there's at least some analogy to be had, and I think fairly close with the Eucharist. And I'm going to use like the Latin Rite use of hosts as an example. But you have the hosts at this Mass, you've got the hosts at the parish county over, you've got the hosts across the world in a different tabernacle somewhere, right? In some sense, this host is not that host, but both of them are Jesus. So what they are is the same. So even though there's a distinction, right, this host is not, you can make a distinction between one host and another, insofar as its physical locale is different. But the reality that is there is the same reality. It's the one Christ. And that is something the Orthodox also understand, and they emphasize. In a similar way, each diocese, this diocese is not that diocese, but they are both the same church present in their own locales. And so from that sense, it's the one church present in the various locations. And so it's the mystery of the one and the many, but in the sense that the same reality is present. And my argument there is that the local church cannot be fully church unless it is a member of and in communion with the whole church. Teilhard, I think, expresses this well. He goes, look, the local church is holy church, meaning WHOLLY. It is completely church, but it is not the whole church in and of itself, right? And so it must be, in order to have qualitative ecclesiastical fullness, you have to be a member of the Church Universal. You have to be, you can't really have that fullness of what it means to be the church unless you are a Catholic church.
Yeah. And here I think that, the almost, being able to use either word, mystical or real, with regard to the church is really useful, right? Because on the one hand, we are talking about real people in real places, but we're also talking about an experience that's beyond them and beyond time and space even, right?
Right.
You quote Ratzinger here saying, the Eucharist is celebrated with the one Christ and thus with the whole church, or it is not being celebrated at all. And then you also bring in the whole aspect of our worship in these particular locations, which unites us to every other authentic celebration of the Eucharist everywhere else in the world, is also, by the way, participation in heaven itself. So in some sense, what we're saying to somebody who, if we say to them, hey, would you like to come to Mass with me? Another way to say it is, would you like to come to heaven with me? I don't know if you want to take that and run with it. But I mean, I think like the Eucharistic ecclesiology piece, again, is so important in understanding the enormity of what the church really is. That, it's not just a kind of nice place to kind of, practice so that we'll one day go to heaven, right? Or just a nice place to kind of like learn some things so that we can like assent to the right propositions or whatever. But no, it is actually the experience of the kingdom that has come near now.
Can I say one
Right.
thing here though? I mean, like, this is Andrew, and Richard. Richard, when you were talking, it just occurred to me too that like so many of the debates in philosophy, you talk about the one and the many, and then Andrew, you're talking about like kind of this eschatological, how we talk about like heaven, these eschatological realities, and like even now when we talk about the relation between time and eternity, all these things, it's almost like, Richard, what you're saying, not only with systematic theology does ecclesiology kind of address so many of the different aspects of it. It's kind of like a nice gateway in that or encapsulates so much. This also could be, in a way, a helpful way of I mean, obviously, this is we're doing theology, we're not doing philosophy, but it can be a helpful like way of directing philosophy in a direction to perhaps overcome some of those those debates. Or maybe even taking some of the philosophy that perhaps and then imposing that upon the theology may actually then lead to the problems when you don't have the ontological primacy of the universal church in relating to the local particular churches.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of my hobby horses, and particularly when it comes to evangelization or apologetics, I'm constantly emphasizing this point, which is that the church is not ancillary to salvation. It is literally essentially what salvation is. Like what like and it all, one of the things I like to emphasize is the fact that if God is the origin and end of all things, right? And that means God, who is triune, it's a communion of persons, of divine persons. Communion is sort of the essence of real existence, right? And therefore, sin, which divides and separates, needs to be overcome. Well, overcoming sin doesn't just mean I get forgiven legalistically for my own individual failings. It's like, no, I am brought back into communion with God, and therefore, and also with the rest of the human race that's united with God. Like the whole purpose is to unite all in Christ. And so in some ways, then heaven, is where this unity that man was created for comes to full fruition. So the church, the eschatological church is the ultimate goal. The whole goal, and I think even Aquinas said this, I think I quote that somewhere from Aquinas, where the whole purpose of all of this is for Christ to be presented with the eschatological church as his bride. And therefore, the communion of the members of the body of Christ as one body, the communion that the church is, that's part of salvation. Because if salvation is a share in divine life and divine life is communal, then salvation is communal. It's not merely individualistic. It is. So the church is what I call it the first effect of the saving work of Christ. It's what is generated out of that saving work. But yeah, this problem of the one of the many, I mean, obviously goes way back in the ancient philosophers in some sense. But there are a lot of these movements where it's like, oh, we're searching for unity and all that, and oneness with the universe or whatever. But what I like about the Catholic approach, and this is something that Ratzinger is very good at pointing out. I actually wrote an article, and I think I don't remember if it's out yet. I think it's out. It's one of the Evangelization and Culture Journal articles on Ratzinger on prayer. And one of the things he points out is that the distinction between Christian prayer and like the Asiatic mystery religions is that their prayer is meant to dissolve the individual into the universal one, where they lose their own identity, and which they see as merely an illusion. And he's like, no, the unity of the church and the unity of prayer that we have in Christian prayer is a unity in which the distinction remains. Like you don't lose yourself. You become most yourself, but you don't cease being what you are, right? You are united with Christ and through him with the whole Trinity. And you are united, but you don't lose your own individual identity. And so the one and the many are allowed to, they remain one and many. And the unity involved here is an interpersonal unity. It's not an eradication of the individual person, but a uniting of the individual persons in this great reality or mystery.
The
Yeah, and it really is. Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
No,
Bobby. I
no,
think
no,
you
no,
have a
no.
better
I'm
point.
going to take us down a rabbit hole that is going to really take us off from the ecclesiology stuff. So I hand it over to you, Andrew.
Well, let me just say really quick then, and then we'll throw it back to you for to make our next step. But now I'm forgetting what I was going to say. I mean, here again, I think we have like a good for our age today by understanding the church as Eucharistic. We have a good antidote, I think, to either this, kind of new agey nihilism, kind of melt into nothingness, but also an antidote to just a kind of individualistic rationalism that's just about me and my God and even me and my sacraments, right? I mean, even thinking of the sacraments as like taking your medicine, as it were, like your own individualistic meal that, there happens to be this person here next to me or whatever, that they might not be, who knows, but rather to think instead of that this is what we, you know, I as me, you as you, never going to change that, but that we have to do together because the ultimate vision of reality. I mean, I think it even says somewhere in Lumen Gentium or somewhere that, that the unity of the church presupposes a prior unity of humankind. Right. And so then,
Right.
as you've already said, like the mission of the church then is to be this, I think you make the point in here that it is about bringing Jews and Gentiles into one new humanity, which is an extraordinary thought.
Yeah, it's extremely important. And this is where I think, error often comes in from overemphasizing one aspect at the expense of another and losing the balance. And it's understandable in some sense that people would react against to the overemphasis on the communal aspect of the liturgy and of the church, like in a sort of 1960s hippie fashion where, Mass became about the community and like sort of the sacrifice sort of got left aside. It became like this communal meal and it almost became like the community worshiping itself sort of thing. And the overemphasis on that aspect and forgetting that no, it's what unites us together is the sacrifice of Christ. So it's first vertical, and only through that vertical are we united horizontally. That's Ratzinger's point. But you can take that so far where if you react against that overemphasis on the local community, the parish or whatever, or if you just reject that, you can end up with another monstrous idea, which is sort of as if you get some people that react against that in a more traditionalist vein will basically not even pay attention to the communal dimension, and they'll almost have an attitude that suggests, well, ideally, all of us as either individuals or maybe at best every family would have their own mass, but since we don't have that many priests, we all have to gather together at this building. Right. And that was sort of suggested in the fact that, there's emphasis on not concelebrating. Every priest should have their own mass. And if he has to do that by himself, that's better than being at the communal celebration. And this notion that we only really gather as a parish because we just have to. We don't all have a priest in our family that can just do this for us. And it's like this necessary. It's like, no, actually, it's exact opposite. The ideal, and this is something that comes out in recent magisterial texts too, is like actually the ideal would be for all the people in a given diocese to all attend the same mass under the presidency of the bishop. And the only reason we have parishes is because the bishop can't be present at every liturgy because we can't all gather together. Like, no, actually, the fewer individual masses there are, the better, because the ideal is all being united in the worship of God together. And the only reason we have separate parishes and separate mass times is because we can't all fit in the same place regularly. Right? It's, and this is obviously true insofar as you consider the eschatological wedding feast of the Lamb. It's going to be one heavenly liturgy. It's not many. And the multiplication of the many is the thing that's the necessary division, given our finite limitations. But that's not the ideal. And that comes out in Eucharistic ecclesiology precisely by the fact that the Eucharist is not just me communing with Jesus individually. It really is being incorporated and perfected in my communion with the church as a whole. Now, what I think is important is obviously the notion that it connects me not just with my parish, not just with the parishioners at this particular Mass, but with the Church Universal, past, present, and future. So there's this synchronic unity or contemporaneous unity and diachronic unity, the unity throughout time, that the reception of Holy Communion gives me access to, and truly is uniting me with the church past, present, future, and eschatological.
It's interesting what that does to your notion of time. I mean, you think, I mean, even just to make sense of Christ being like truly present, and the kind of the not just a, like kind of going back in the commemoration of Christ and his sacrifice isn't just a kind of a recalling of that, but it becomes present again. And then also when you talk about participating in the future of that, when you were writing this, Richard, I was thinking, if this is kind of us gathering in the wedding feast of the Lamb, which is kind of like you call it the living Sinai. It's the other day I was down in the mountains and it's to see everybody hiking towards those peaks. It's as if the peak itself is drawing everybody up to itself. And that it kind of that vision of unity is something that when you talk about it with kind of like with the going into the future, what does that do to your notion of kind of what I mean, inevitably, we're a podcast about hope, right? It inevitably gives you the hope, and you're putting that into practice every single day. So, I'm just, do you have any kind of words? Like, I know we're going, I don't know, getting close to the end here. Do you have anything, since this is the Spe Salvi Institute, do you have anything to say about that? Your last part here is on the mission of the church, but you really emphasize the eschatological dimension of the church.
Right. I mean, the whole goal of the church is to bring as many souls as possible into the communion of saints, right? And, I think this can also help for people who are more traditional bent. I mean, we believe in the communion of saints. It's in the creed, right? Like this is, this communion amongst the saints. It's not just the saints individually being united with God, but they're united with one another through that aspect. But the reality of the Eucharist really gives us that hope of eternal life, right? I think, God is a poet. He's not just a great philosophy teacher, right? He's also poetic. Like in this, all these Old Testament prefigurements of the church. When you look at the slavery in Egypt is an analogy or a prefigurement of the slavery to sin, right? Well, how will we say, well, saved through the waters of the Red Sea, we're saved through the waters of baptism spiritually, that begins a process of suffering that one has to endure in the desert. And that took about a generation, so a lifetime, the 40 years wandering in the desert. What's the temptation? Oh, maybe we should just go back into slavery. This is too hard. At least we had, meat we could eat back in Egypt, Well, what does God do? He sustains them with the bread come down from the manna in the desert, right? And what is Jesus saying? Well, no, now I give you the Eucharist, which is the true bread from heaven, myself, and that's going to sustain you and fortify you for this pilgrim journey that you're on. And so the wandering in the desert is sort of a prefigurement of our wandering through this earthly life, being fed by Christ himself to sustain us spiritually for this difficult journey. But all of that will end in the entrance into the promised land, right? We're going to, in the communion of heaven. So we're already participating in that now. And I think precisely insofar as we have a devotion to the Eucharist and really love the Eucharist, and try to live Eucharistically. This is another thing that Benedict's been on, big on. The Eucharist is something we're also called to live. We receive the love of God, and therefore we share the love of God in our lives. And that, seeing the strength we get from the Eucharist to do that, gives us the hope that we're on the right path. And when we see other people joining us, the converts that come in at the Easter Vigil or throughout the year, like all of that goes, oh man, people are getting this. People are being saved. This is worthwhile. And we're all headed towards this, communion of saints in heaven. I think all of that is a great hope. And I think it's easy because we receive, we go to Mass so frequently, hopefully, people are doing that, to sort of lose that sense of it. But I think when we really take a step back and meditate on these mysteries, it really does give us great hope, because we know that Christ is literally giving us himself to unite us with himself and with one another. And that, as great as that is here and now, it's still only a foreshadowing of the fullness that we will be as the members of the Church Triumphant.
This is incredibly encouraging stuff, Richard, and we'll have to pick it up again real soon. But for now, we want to encourage all of our listeners and viewers to go find your article. It's readily available online to read for free. It's called Eucharistic Ecclesiology. It's in the Encyclopedia of Catholic Theology. Also, go and get Richard's book, The Mind of Benedict XVI. It's terrific. We talked about it with him before. There it is, that great image of our late pontiff on there. And so, Richard, we just want to thank you for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's always great to talk to you guys.
It is indeed. We'll have to do it again real soon. And for all of our listeners and viewers, we appreciate very much your support of the work that we're doing, for listening to these conversations, for sharing them, and for supporting this mission that we believe we have been called to undertake. So until next time, God bless you all and live in hope.